All right. Hey, everybody. Ken Gouchi back at you with the Veterans Angle podcast. I realize it has been a long time since you've all heard from me. I had some pretty serious health issues going on. Obviously, my pancreas and my kidneys and just a whole bunch of stuff. You know, this is what happens when you spend many, many years of your life drinking yourself to death. The damage that it does to your body, man, I will spend the rest of my life trying to recover from the damage that I did to myself as a young man. But anyway, I'm glad to be back. You know, GoDaddy renewed my website. I was not intending on continuing this podcast. Everybody all 12 of my subscribers, y'all might remember when there was 3 of us that, kind of started this whole thing. And before that, I had several different podcasts. Most notably was called Wienerfied. Before that, it was the Midnight Riders. And one of the reasons that I kind of broke away from the 3 of us that were doing this and everything is because I'm really not a very political guy. I hate politics, and I'm not a very religious guy either because I hate religion. For all of you who know me, I'm a proud Freemason. I've been a Freemason for almost 20 years. I could tell you all the story of how I got into it and all that kind of stuff, but with all of the stuff that's going on in today's world, everything from Charlie Kirk, right? We've got political assassinations. Now we've got attacks on Mormon churches. And if any of you have ever watched me before, right, there's a definite Masonic connection between the Mormon church and, Joseph Smith and, the whole founding of that church and religion and everything. So I'm going to get into a lot of that stuff. My podcast now is basically going to revert back to talking about societal issues, masculinity issues. But a lot of it is also just going to be here trying to connect the dots for anyone who might have some curiosity. And I'll tell you, I was just watching a video on YouTube a couple days ago or a couple weeks ago, and it kind of got me thinking about restarting all this and everything. So, and it's about the Knights Templar, and it's about Christianity and all this stuff. So what we'll do, it's a voice only. This podcast that I was watching was only a voice podcast. It wasn't a video podcast, but we can go ahead and watch a little bit of it and kind of see where I'm going to stop. I probably won't watch the whole 15 minutes of it, but let's just kind of get in here, because what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to clarify a few things for people that are obviously very confused. And this includes a lot of Freemasons out there, who don't really believe in any of the old, esoteric mysticism and all that kind of stuff. This is kind of a lot of, I call all, modern Freemasonry, I call them all minnows, right? Masons in name only, because most of these guys are not serious about the craft. Most of them are just there for, social connections. It really has turned into a good old boys club where people can't even show up to a regular lodge meeting, so they don't even have the discipline to do that. They don't even have the dedication to the craft to do that. So how are they ever going to be able to take advantage of the rest of it and become better men out of it if they're not even willing to show up to a meeting? And, myself was included in that. I haven't been active in the lodge in, I don't know, like 10 years or something. I don't know. But again, I am a 32nd degree Yorkite. Obviously it's not really degrees, but it's the equivalent to a 32nd degree. And so I've been studying this stuff for my entire life. And it's kind of interesting because I also grew up Mormon. So I know a little bit about that as well. But let's start this, let's listen. Let's just take a listen to this guy. And then I want to get into it. So welcome back, everybody. Let's go ahead and play.
Hello, brothers and sisters. Today, for this special episode, I just kind of want to continue on in this series where I have been warning you about different paths within Freemasonry. And today I want to talk about one that I'm sure when I mentioned it in that previous episode, caught your eye. or ear, and that is the Knights Templar. Now, if you're like most people, when you hear that name, automatically your mind goes to the history books, right? To Crusaders, or even maybe some adventure movies. But that's not what we're talking about here today. We're not talking about that medieval military order that existed in the Middle Ages. No. We're going to be talking about the Masonic order that carries their name. Most Masons will try to claim this name as the same group, that it's linked all the way to the past, but it's not. It's rooted right there in the lodge. Now, the Bible tells us in 1 John chapter 4, verse 11, it says, "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirit whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world." Now, those false prophets also include organizations that slap on a little coat of paint and dress themselves up in Christian imagery, because they're really built on false foundations. So let's take a moment and talk about the true Knights Templar. The Knights Templar were originally founded in 1119 AD. They were a military monastic order who were sworn to protect pilgrims that traveled to the Holy Land. Of course, because of what they were doing, they grew rich and powerful. They controlled banks and castles and even their own army. By the year 1312, the Pope at the time disbanded them. We're not going to go into too much, but the Pope accused them of heresy and idolatry and, of course, secret rituals. Now, of course, historians, myself included, debate those charges. But what we do know is that the Templars, well, they became a legend. Their secrecy and their wealth gave rise to all of these different myths that inspired later secret societies. But what about the Masonic Knights Templar? Well, you'll have to fast forward into the 18th century. This is when we can speculate that, Freemasonry was spreading through Europe.
All right, so I got to stop it already. Here again, this guy is claiming to be a historian. He's some low-end minister, pastor. I don't know where he's from. First of all, he obviously doesn't realize that in American Freemasonry, the mass majority of members are actually Christian, especially from the Baptist faith. Right? Obviously, there's there's like Catholics. Catholics are not supposed to be Freemasons, but I even know a few of those guys. Right? I know a few Catholics who are Freemasons. They're also Knights of Columbus, and when you look at things like what this guy is talking about, he does not know the actual history of it. So what I'm going to do today, and forgive me, folks, this might actually take, an hour. I don't know. I don't want to try to get too long into this, but to start this story, first we have to begin with the man that you all know as Jesus. Now, the name Jesus, there was no man named Jesus. Jesus, right? The God, right? That's what that title, that name means, the God. Jesus. It means that in Greek, and that's where he got his name from at the Council of Nicaea. That's when Constantine assigned that name to the man that was technically not named Jesus. His name was actually Yeshua, right? Joshua. Not Yahweh, okay? Not any of this stuff. Yeshua was an Egyptian Gnostic priest. He was not Jewish. And this is where the entire secret, right? This is what the entire secret in Freemasonry revolves around. Jesus was an Egyptian Gnostic. He was not a Christian. The word Christian or Christ or Jesus, none of that existed, right? He was not Jewish. He was not a Jewish rabbi. Otherwise, he would have spoken Hebrew instead of Aramaic. And I know Wesley Huff and all these guys, they got their whatever, they got their new shrimp evidence and all this shit. But the bottom line is that Jesus was an Egyptian Gnostic. He was actually descended from the line of Joseph the Pharaoh, not the other Joseph, that they try to make you believe. He was derived from the Egyptian lineage of Joseph the Pharaoh, right? The guy who got kidnapped or sold into slavery when he was a kid, and then he rose up to be like the top general of the pharaohs, and then he later became, actual Egyptian royalty. That is the bloodline that Jesus was descended from. Now, to kind of tie this all together, most people don't realize that Cleopatra, right? Cleopatra was descended directly from the same line as Alexander the Great, right? She was Greek. Cleopatra was the Egyptian Gnostic queen. She started banging this dude, this funny guy, this guy named Julius Caesar, right? I believe they even had a kid together. When that went south, she flipped over and she started banging Mark Antony, right? Everybody remembers Mark Antony. And obviously when Cleopatra and Mark Antony both died very close, the whole story is out there, right? I mean, Mark Antony got killed and Cleopatra, whatever, some people think that she poisoned herself with some, whatever, pit venom snakes or whatever. But nonetheless, that is where the Romans learned about Gnosticism. That is where the Gnostic sects began, was through Cleopatra. Basically pushing it through Rome, through people like Mark Antony and Julius Caesar. Now, fast forward, 30, 35 years, however, because that's another thing. Most scholars can't even pinpoint the exact time that Jesus, the guy named Jesus, his name wasn't Jesus, his name was Yeshua, but most scholars can't even pinpoint the exact year that the dude was born. But I digress. The point is that Jesus was from a royal bloodline of Egyptian lineage, not Jewish lineage. Now, let's fast forward, right? Jesus becomes who he is. And I'm going to kind of get to a couple of different things in here, so try to stay with me, but let's get to Jesus' later years. So, it is believed amongst some, not all, but it is believed amongst some, that Jesus had up to 4 wives. His first wife was Mary Magdalene, and she was a Gnostic priestess. She was also not Jewish. She was Greek, and she was descended from the same line as Cleopatra. Okay, so Mary Magdalene was a Gnostic priestess, and this is how she lived and died. And I can prove that. But anyway, we believe that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a daughter named Sarah. Okay. Jesus had a second wife named Sophia. And Sophia and Jesus had a son named Thomas. It's believed that Sarah, his daughter, was about 3 years older than his son Thomas. Now, you're not going to find this information anywhere, and there's going to be plenty of people that are going to curse me out and cuss me up all, tell me the Antichrist and whatever, blah, blah, blah. And that's fine. You're all entitled to your beliefs, and I will defend your right to believe whatever you want with my life. But here's the truth, and here's the hoax that has been organized religion for the last 2,000 years. Okay, the original Gnostics, right, here again, this goes back, John the Baptist was obviously Yeshua's cousin. He was a Gnostic priest, and he had a direct connection to Cleopatra and Mark Antony before they died, like 30 years before Jesus was born. Right? John the Baptist was the actual original revolutionist. This is why the Jews killed him, right? They beheaded him. And that is what pissed off Yeshua. Yeshua was pissed. He was a revolutionist. He was a Gnostic warrior. You all need to remember that prior to 325 AD in the Council of Nicaea, there was no such thing as Christianity. Okay, there was no such thing as Jesus. There were a whole bunch of different movements, right? You had your Hermetics and you had all these other, different Jewish sects, right? But none of them called themselves Christian, right? Christ, the anointed one. Here again, another Greek word that wasn't created until 325 AD. And basically what happened is Constantine needed a new Hercules. He needed a Zeus, right? So he took the story of Yeshua. That story of Yeshua would have never even made its way back to Rome if it had not been for that Cleopatra connection with Mark Antony, right? We know that Pontius Pilate had huge admiration for Mark Antony, and we know that Pontius Pilate, if he even existed, right? If he even existed, we know that Pontius Pilate was really enthralled with Gnosticism, right? He was really intrigued by it, if he was real. But enough of that. I'm not here to debate the whole structure of Christianity or the history of it. I'm here to debate the history of Yeshua, and I'm here to prove a point about Knights Templars and Masons. So Jesus had at least 2 wives. We think he had 4, but we don't think he had any children with the last 2. So when he was crucified, they went their own way. They said, they just kind of dispersed into the population. Sarah and Mary Magdalene were able to escape to southern France, right, after the crucifixion. And this is pretty well documented. I mean, obviously movies like the Da Vinci Code and all this other shit, they talk about this, but they only kind of, they give kind of the fiction narrative. They don't really give the factual narrative. But we know for a fact that Mary Magdalene escaped to southern France, right? They got her skull at whatever the one church is. I can't remember the name of the church, but I've seen it. I've seen her skull. I've seen the Black Madonnas. I've been all over southern France. I've been all over Europe. I've been all over Europe. And I've been studying this stuff for my entire life, really. I mean, I spent 7 years in Germany. For everybody who knows me, I've got 2 full-grown, grown-up adult daughters over there. And that's where I got into Freemasonry, and it was literally because I was so interested in the architecture and in the history of it. And obviously, I always had kind of a doubt in the back of my mind about all religions. And I say this constantly. I tell people that if you do not understand the purpose of religion, then it is impossible to understand anything else about it. But what we know that Christianity is almost completely fabricated. We know this. We know that none of the Gospels were written during the lifetime of Yeshua. None of the Gospels were written by the actual apostles. They weren't written until several hundred years later. Right? Even Paul's letters, it has been pretty consistently proven that Paul's letters, his first letter would have been the book of Acts. But they know just from evaluating it and comparing things that type of speech that was written in that didn't even exist until the 4th century. So again, and we can also see that, other deities, pre-existing deities, Mithras and Krishna and Dionysus. But we know that the story of Jesus is almost identical to the story of Horus, right? Isis and Osiris and all that stuff. The Gnostics, right? So this all goes back to Gnosticism. And again, that connection between Cleopatra, Mary Magdalene, which was from Cleopatra's bloodline, and a slew of other connections. Now, after the crucifixion, there is no doubt in my mind that a man named Yeshua was a revolutionist. He got charged with insurrection against Judaism. That was his official, that was his charge. That is what they crucified him for. Now, the original Gnostics did not believe that Jesus was resurrected. They did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. And I'll kind of get into a lot of this stuff a little later, even with like Islam and some movements that kind of, sparked from this, right? Yes, I said it, folks. Islam and Christianity. Muhammad is Jesus. I'm sorry to tell you all this. Islam started out as a Christian sect, right? But I'll get into that later. Let's get back to Mary Magdalene and Jesus. And so after Jesus was crucified, Mary and Sarah escaped to southern France. Sophia and Thomas escaped to Egypt. Now, Sophia was Jewish. Sophia, his second wife and mother of Thomas, Sophia was from the bloodline of David and Solomon. She was pure Jewish royalty. And I won't get into the names and everything else that's associated with her because, again, it's easily researchable for anybody that actually wants to dig in and get outside of their bubble a little bit. This is actually very easy information to find if you're actually trying to do it. But you got to be brave enough to look outside of your bubble. And here's the thing. The story of Jesus, okay, Jesus was not, and I'll kind of get into the other issues here in a little bit, but let's continue with the history a little bit. So after the crucifixion, Mary and Sarah went to France, Sophia and Thomas went to Egypt. A few years later, Sophia and Thomas went ahead and sailed across the Mediterranean, and they reunited with Mary, Magdalene, and Sarah. Now, if everybody looks at the history books, it's kind of interesting because everybody hears of a name. They hear this name of the Merovingians, but they don't understand exactly what spawned that lineage. Well, when Sarah and Thomas reached a certain age, it's believed that Sarah was probably about 16 and Thomas was probably about 13 or 14. They were married. Yes, as half brother and half sister, they were married. Mary Magdalene and Sophia never remarried. They remained as sister wives for the rest of their lives in southern France. And I'm going to kind of get into a few things with this, and especially dealing like with the early Mormon belief system and polygamy and all kinds of stuff. But this is a very old Masonic belief that has fallen out of circulation. People just refuse to even talk about it anymore because they don't want to cause any waves. This is the belief. That bloodline, that perfect genetic combination of Jewish, Greek, and Egyptian, right, from Yeshua, Mary, and Sophia, that technically is the Trinity. That is the genetic combination that created the strongest, most powerful, richest bloodline in human history. Mary Magdalene started the Merovingian bloodline by marrying her daughter and Thomas, Sophia's son, so the direct descendants of Yeshua himself. They were married. They produced offspring. Those offspring married each other and produced more offspring. And this is how the Merovingian bloodline, this is also the beginning of the European Ashkenazi Jews. Right? And if you look at, you can do a simple Wikipedia search if you want to. You can see that the Ashkenazi Jewish movement started in Europe about 2,000 years ago. But yet they never admit who started it. So even though Yeshua was not Jewish, Sophia was Jewish. And with that triple genetic, right, you've got Greek, Egyptian, and Jewish. That created the Merovingian bloodline. And to this day, this is why this bloodline is the richest. This is why they own all the banks, right? This pastor wanted to talk about banking and all this and all that. But I'm going to clear up a couple of myths for this guy. So it took a few hundred years for the Merovingians to really come into power in France, right? But if everybody looks at history, isn't it interesting that at about the exact same time that the Merovingians started rising in power, 4th century, right? That's also the exact same time that Constantine started creating Christianity. And the whole myth that we had this resurrected Son of God that, none of that existed prior to that. And here again, Wesley Huff can argue all day long. He can say, letters were written in 35 AD. No, they weren't, dude. No, they weren't. Okay? The religion was fabricated at the Council of Nicaea, and it was basically just taking parts of every religion. It basically took some Judaism, threw in some, Gnosticism, threw in some Hermeticism, threw in some Hinduism. It has elements of all pre-existing religions. It has Zoroastrianism in there. It has Sumerianism in there, right? Words like hell never existed prior to the Council of Nicaea. And I get this argument a lot, like, Christians were started by Jesus. No, they weren't. Okay, the word Christian didn't exist prior to 325 AD. That's just a fact. But isn't it interesting that at almost the exact same time as the Romans, right, Constantine, the people that were basically responsible for killing Yeshua, right, you can blame them or you can blame the Jews, whatever. But either way it goes, the Romans were in control. But isn't it interesting that at almost the exact same time, the Merovingians started rising in power in France? Now, let's fast forward 1,000 years, well, about 700 years after the Council of Nicaea, right? This preacher mentions the formation of the Knights Templar. What he doesn't mention is that the Knights Templar, all 9 of the original members, were Merovingian royalty from France. Every single one of them. And this is what bothers me even about the Masonic records and even about the Masonic myths. But again, I'm a York Rite Mason. I've been in this stuff for a long time. The Knight Templars were not some poor group of people that just, oh man, we need a job, so let's go work for Rome. That is not what they were. Every single one of them was from the Merovingian bloodline. They were royalty. They were all rich. They were already rich, and they were already Gnostic because the Merovingian bloodline held the original beliefs of Yeshua, the Gnostic warrior. They held that belief they've got that same belief to this day. They are Gnostics. They are not Christians. Now, I've actually had to renounce my membership in the York Rite. I can no longer claim to be Christian because of the research that I've done on this, and so I can no longer technically belong to the York Rite, and that sucks because that's really the only part of Masonry that I even enjoy outside of the Shriners. But my point remains the same. The Knights Templar. Here's the thing. Everybody thinks that they didn't learn their secret until they went to Israel and got underneath temples, right? Got underneath Solomon's temple and found all this information. That's not true. The Templars were the secret. They were the direct descendants of Yeshua. And I'm going to make that connection for y'all here in a little bit, but let's continue moving forward a little bit. So this guy talks about the day that the Knights Templar, right, Friday the 13th, well, is it August 1307 or whatever? Okay, so he says that the Templars became so powerful that the church decided to crush them. And that's not exactly true. What happened is the Merovingians decided to allow Rome, because Rome was getting all of their money from the Merovingians. And they still do to this day. But the Merovingians, they didn't want Rome to lose its power because they were making too much money off of it. Here again, banking, when the Templars created banking, they did that because they had ancient mystic knowledge that was passed on to them from Yeshua himself. And again, I'm going to get to that connection here in a little bit. The point is that the Knight Templars, they did not learn some new secret when they went to Israel. They were already rich. They were already the most powerful family in Europe. Okay? And again, it came from that perfect trinity of Jewish, Greek, and Egyptian pure genetic DNA. This is why this group of people, these Ashkenazi Jewish Merovingian bloodline people, are still the highest IQ people on earth to this day. This is why they own the world. This is why they own the banks. This is why they own Hollywood. Everybody makes fun of this specific group of Jews. And I can even get into like Hitler and, why Hitler hated them and all this kind of stuff. But it all goes back to that direct link to Yeshua, to Jesus. Okay? That is the secret. The secret is that Jesus was never God. That is the secret. That's the Masonic. That's what we have been sworn to uphold and keep secret, right? The secret is that. The secret is that Jesus was not here to create a new religion. Jesus was here to end religion. Right? So you could technically call Jesus the Antichrist. He was against organized religion. He specifically called the rabbis, he said that they are parasites. In fact, one of my favorite quotes is, no greater sin has ever been created than when men learned how to control other men through the fear of God. Until men learned how to capitalize on it. And see, that's what bothers me about this little pastor making this little fake-ass video. So he has made his entire livelihood based off of convincing other people that they're supposed to follow his narrative. Because that's the only truth, is his truth. Because it comes from the Bible. Let's get to that, because he obviously doesn't understand that King James himself was a Freemason. Okay, the Bible that all of you love so much was translated by a Freemason / Knight Templar, but I'm about to make that connection here too. So the Templars did lose control. The Templars they didn't lose control. Rome went to war against them. Rome went to war against the Templars because the Templars were actively pushing a Gnostic narrative. Now, remember, supposedly, Christianity spawned from Gnosticism, right? There's no debating that the original Jesus, Yeshua, was Gnostic. He was not Christian because Christianity did not exist. How could Christianity exist prior to the New Testament being canonized? How? Here's the thing. I love religious people that have spent their entire lives keeping themselves in this little bubble that they think they know everything that there is to know about it. But it's not that complicated of a story. It's actually pretty simple once you just lay it out and say, okay, this is the way it went. And, it's affected the world for 2,000 years, right? I mean, the Jews claim that they're God's chosen people. That's a pretty easy claim to make when they're the ones who wrote the book, right? But I digress. Let's get back to the Knights Templar and the Merovingian bloodline. So when the Templars got crushed, right, on Friday the 13th, 1307, they dispersed. They dispersed all over the place. Some of them went to Portugal. Some of them went to England. Some of them went to Scotland, right? And this is where we see places like Edinburgh. For anyone who's never been there, Edinburgh is the Mecca for Knight Templars, right? But this is also where we see the Templars kind of disappear, right? We believe that some of them might have came to America. Some of them might have gone to South America. They dispersed all over the place. Some of them believe that a few of them went to like Oak Island up in Canada and kinds of shit, right? I'm gonna get to that in future episodes. But for now, it's just important to know that the Templars were never crushed. They were never beaten. They simply went underground because Rome was after them. And with the failure of the Crusades, that really was a failure. Crusades were, there was only the Second Crusade where they were able to retake Jerusalem or whatever. But the Crusades were actually an incredible failure. It was one of those military campaigns where, Rome They didn't care because it wasn't their people. But they were willing to send anybody and everybody to the slaughter that they could, and that's exactly what they did. There was really no room for it, no reason for it, other than a couple of different religious people clashing and, starting some trouble. But I'll get to the whole Islamic thing later. The Templars went silent, especially in Edinburgh. But then about 100 years later, not even that. 100 years later, we see the very first documents of Freemasonry coming from Edinburgh. Here again, King James himself was a Freemason. And he was a Freemason before he translated the Bible. He came from Edinburgh. He came from that Templar lineage. He came from that Merovingian bloodline. This is why he left all kinds of codes and, little secret things in the Bible, that only Masons can understand. But again, most Masons don't even know that. Most Masons don't know that the King James Bible is chock full of codes and, little secret things. But the point remains the same, that King James continued that line from Templar to Freemason. That is the connection. That is the literal connection. Okay, Freemasonry has been in power ever since then. But even we've had times in our history where we've had to go dark or we've had to go underground. 1930s in Germany is a perfect example. Everybody thinks that the Jews were the first group of people that Hitler put his kill list on, and that's not true. The first group of people that Hitler put a kill list on was Freemasons. Plus a Freimaurer, right? That's the German word for Freemason. Freimaurer. Okay, again, I can connect all the dots for that, and I could, I can get into Hitler and the Thule Society and everything, everything that he believed. He knew that the Ashkenazi Jews were direct descendants of Yeshua. He knew that. It's one of the reasons why he was such a staunch atheist, right? And again, the Thule Society, not even really atheist if you really look at it, because they believe in all the Norse, like Thor and all that shit, right? Nothing bad about it. It's just that they don't really know their own facts. And Hitler, especially, was very, very confused. He was against the banks. He was not against, he didn't, Hitler started off as not that crazy, right? He spent the first 10 years of his political life telling the world what he was going to do. And it's just unfortunate that nobody actually believed him. But he told the world what he was going to do. And again, he did not start off by killing Jews. He started off by killing Freemasons. And to this day in Germany, Masonic lodges are held underground. Now, without getting into the rituals and all this kind of stuff, it's important for people to understand the reason that Masons have the rituals we have is because they were directly passed to us through Templar revelations, through Templar knowledge. Okay? We would not be able to. Now, there's no doubt that there is definitely some, there's some fabricated, right? There's a big part of it that's probably very fabricated. For start, the fact that you have to pledge Christianity to be a York Rite Mason, that in and of itself is actually anti-Templar, right? Because the Templars were disbanded by Christianity. Again, because they were Gnostic. The point is that is the connection. Now, we could even get into Jesus a little bit. Most people don't understand, well, how did the Templars and how did the Merovingians? Okay, so Jesus, let's take him. Yeshua, right? Again, the guy named Jesus never existed. Yeshua, when King James translated the Bible, he gave Yeshua a very specific title. The title was carpenter. Well, guess what, folks? 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, there wasn't a lot of woodwork going on, okay? There still isn't. They don't have any trees there. Everything there was built out of stone and clay. It still is to this day. My point is that Jesus was not just a carpenter. He was a master stonemason. This is how I know that he was Egyptian, because the only people in those times that would have been able to belong to one of those guilds would have either had to be Egyptian or Greek. And the reason for that is because the stonemasons back in the day, remember the guys that built Solomon's temple and even the pyramids, if you want to date it that far back, they had a set of knowledge, especially when it came to mathematics, right? Arithmetic and geometry and trigonometry and, stuff like that. These guys had an ancient builder's knowledge. This is why stonemasons were responsible for building all of the cathedrals, right? All of the castles. And they were the only group of people that were free to travel from location to location, right? Because no country had a problem with them because they were doing good work with building their stuff. In fact, most people could probably attribute all of civilization to that stonemason knowledge of being able to build architecture, that kind of thing. That's what being a mason is supposed to be about. It's about knowing how to build. Now, Jesus or Yeshua would have been a master stonemason. Again, he was born from the line of Joseph the Pharaoh. So he knew how to build pyramids. He knew the secrets of King Solomon's temple. And this also means that he would have been some royalty. He would have belonged to a royal bloodline, because the only people in those times that were allowed to belong to these stonemason guilds were people of nobility. Okay? So that by itself. Now, Jesus, Yeshua, he would have been incredibly rich because he was the master mason. So he either owned or he managed his own guild. And this really explains those 18 years missing of his life. He was traveling. He was in India. He was in Tibet. He was building. He wasn't just studying. Of course, that's a never-ending process. He had ritualistic, symbolic things that he passed on through Mary Magdalene and through Thomas and Sarah. Right? These were young children when he was crucified. But Mary Magdalene and Sophia were able to continue on the knowledge, the esoteric knowledge of the ancients. And that is what has been passed down the line of the Merovingian bloodline. Right? All the way through the Templars. The Templars they got all their ideology from something. They got it from the stonemasons. Okay, so then the stonemasons become Merovingians, and Merovingians become Templars. The Templars then become Freemasons, which was supposed to divert the group back to the ancient ways. Unfortunately, Freemasonry split off, right? This is where we see things like the Illuminati, this and that, right? I mean, I could even get into like and Mormonism. I mean, I'll get into that in other episodes. But the point is that it is a very easy connection to make if you're actually willing to make that connection. Now, again, the secret is not that, the secret is literally that Jesus was nothing more. He was not God. He was not the Son of God. He was not the Trinity. He was not any of these things, right? He wasn't even resurrected. We know this from historical documents. The original Gnostics and the original Coptics, and obviously the Jews and everybody else in that region, did not believe that he was resurrected. Jesus was a normal guy. He probably had one of the highest IQs of any person in that time period. That's straight up. He came from a royal bloodline. He was a revolutionist. And again, Jesus was not here to create a new religion. Jesus was here to end religion. I'll say to this pastor, because I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to do a new episode next week, kind of continuing on in this saga. But it's important for me to put this out there. So this guy's talking about false prophets, and he's talking about, the evil of masonry and all this kind of stuff. Of course, he's never been through it himself, so he really doesn't know. And of course, he's never been brave enough to actually talk to somebody like me who will challenge him on his ideology. And I can bring receipts. I can bring it all day long. I don't even need the Da Vinci Code. I can bring, right? I can bring all kinds of receipts. But the point is that anybody who's actually curious and truly interested in learning about this stuff, you can do it. You just have to be brave enough to go against the herd. And that's all this is. This has been a mass psychosis movement for 2,000 years. Again, it's a pretty easy claim to make for the Jews that they're God's chosen people, right? When they're the ones who wrote the damn book. Right? I mean, it's like, I love the enthusiasm, but basically what you have is you have a group of very highly intelligent people who they understand how the world works. They understand that the two greatest competitive sports ever created is religion and politics. And 9 times out of 10, they go hand in hand with each other because our political views are based off of our religious indoctrination, right? That's what forms our moral code. When you start connecting the dots, though, and when you actually see some of this stuff, and, off the top of my head, I mentioned that Jesus probably had 4 wives. This is actually where Islam got the idea that a man can have 4 wives. But I'll get into that again in future episodes. And, when we look at just all kinds of things that there's physical proof of, like I said, the Black Madonnas exist, right? Mary Magdalene's skull, well, at least what they claim it to be her skull, actually exists. But that all goes against Rome's narrative. You've all fallen for it. This guy is the fake prophet, right? I mean, here's the thing. I'm gonna tell you all a quote. And you probably heard me say this before. Okay, and I'm basing everything off memory here. I don't have anything written down or scripted, so just try to bear with me. But the quote is very simple. It's an old African proverb that I've taken the liberty of modifying and adding to. Okay, so the sheep spends his entire life fearing the wolf, only to be slaughtered and eaten by the shepherd. The shepherd spends his entire life controlling and convincing the sheep to fear the wolf so that the shepherd can justify feeding his family. The wolf doesn't care because he's a fucking wolf and he's going to do exactly what God put him here to do. Okay, Jesus was the wolf. He was sent here to do a specific thing. He was sent here to try to warn all of you sheep not to follow your fake shepherds, but none of you want to listen. Instead, we've got an entire system now of gay pedophile police. I mean, call it what you will. I call it, to me, that is evil. Okay, you've got a bunch of gay police now who have been running around for 2,000 years pretending like they're the sole authority on God, when they are actually the ones that are the most against what Jesus actually preached. Okay, Jesus called the rabbis parasites. And obviously, again, we know that the entire New Testament is fabricated. We know that the entire thing was edited and scripted and deleted, and certain books were left out. It should not be difficult. We have enough information in today's world that people should be able to realize the hoax. Yet here we are, 2,000 years later, still running around, technically 1,700 years later, but we're still running around with this belief. And I get it. Again, I understand the purpose of religion, and I'll go through that in future episodes as well. For today, my point is that there actually is an alternative story that makes sense, right? That's actually a logical thing that people can see. Oh, damn, that makes sense. Okay, instead of believing that. So here's what you have to do in order to believe in Jesus. First, you have to believe that God created evil. Then you have to believe that somehow God let that evil get out of his control. Then you have to believe that God sent himself to earth in the form of Jesus to save humans from the sin that God created to begin with. This is the type of retardation that you have to believe in order to believe in the story of Jesus. The secret, the Masonic secret, and I'll probably get killed for this, who knows? But the Masonic secret is that Jesus was not the Son of God. He was, however, one of the smartest men to ever walk this earth, and his bloodline has created the strongest, richest, most powerful lineage in human history. And again, we could talk about the Illuminati, or we could talk about the Rothschilds and whatever. None of that crap matters. The only thing that matters is that there is a direct link between Mary Magdalene, their children, Sarah and Thomas, the Merovingian bloodline, the rise and fall of it, the rise and fall of the Templars, the rise and fall. You see, it's the same group. They never went away. They just went underground, and then they sprung back up. But they were always rich, and they were always powerful, and that's just the way that they are, because they have the highest IQ in the world because of their bloodline. All right? I would challenge this pastor. I would challenge him to show me one thing that a Knight Templar or that a Freemason has ever lied about. We're not out here trying to bust everybody's faith. We understand the importance of religion, and religion I would rather live in a Christian Judeo society than to live in an atheist society, because I'm definitely not an atheist, but I'm definitely not Christian either. But nonetheless, I would rather prefer to grow up in a Christian Judeo society than to grow up in a Muslim or, hell, even Buddhist. I've spent years of my life overseas in Asia and Europe and the Middle East. I don't want to live in any of those societies. They're all stupid. But the point is, though, is that if I do have to live in this society, then at least people need to be brave enough to have a decent conversation about this stuff. Instead of going out and killing people like Charlie Kirk, or instead of going out and killing Mormons and burning down their church, why are people so afraid to hear opposing views? I want to kind of leave this off with one thing that this pastor, two things. Okay, first of all, this pastor is talking about like idolizing, taking oaths and this kind of stuff. Does he not realize that every time you pledge allegiance to the flag, you're taking a physical oath? You are literally taking an oath and swearing to an inanimate object. Okay? I mean, it's really the same thing with carrying a cross around. Why does he carry a cross? To me, that's idolatry. What the point is that these people are never brave enough to actually get outside of their bubble. When you study, like this guy claimed that he's a historian. There's two different types of people, right? There's the people that try to challenge their pre-existing beliefs, right? These are the people that go out of their bubble. They search for answers. They look at all truths. They look at all stories. And they make a determination based off of that research. But then you've got the other side. They claim that they study, but all they're doing is actually reconfirming their pre-existing beliefs. So in other words, when they study, they're not trying to challenge themselves to lose that belief. They're trying to reconfirm why they believe it. I just happen to be the type of person from a very young age. I just had a very curious mind. I just never wanted to accept the answers for what they were, especially growing up Mormon, because of the way that I knew the church started. Yet, by the time I was there, it had changed so much, it made me question, how could this change like this if this religion was from God? The answer is simple. The reason is because religion is man-made. All of them. Every religion is man-made, and I'm going to get to this. I'm actually writing a book right now, so I can't tell too many of my secrets. But I'm gonna let the world know the truth. And this is that first segment of truth, right? Jesus was not Jewish; he was Egyptian. Jewish was not Christian; he was Gnostic. He was married to at least 2 women, if not 4. Right? Mary Magdalene was his first wife. Sarah was his second wife. He had 2 children with each of them, Sarah and Thomas. They were married in France, and they started the Merovingian bloodline. What is the word Merovingian? What do you think that means? Right? It means Mary Magdalene, right? The descendants of Mary Magdalene. Because that's another thing. I see a lot of comments out there like, they watch the Da Vinci Code, so they think, yeah, Mary had a daughter named Sarah, and she married into some royal bloodline. No, she didn't. Okay, Sarah never married into some royal bloodline because Sarah was the royal bloodline. She came from the King of Kings, which was Yeshua, the Gnostic warrior, not the Christian prince. Okay? So this is just part of the story. This is just part of the equation. I just really wanted to connect the dots today from Jesus to Merovingians to Knight Templars to modern-day Freemasons. Now, again, most modern-day Freemasons don't even know this stuff, and most of them will never acknowledge it because they belong to that same little Christian bubble that everybody else does. But there is more to the story, and I look forward to continuing this with you next time. So, till then, this video should be right at about an hour long. I hope you all enjoy it. You're all more than welcome to challenge me. Just remember that I've already developed my belief system based on many years of actual exploration, right? Study, research, traveling. I've traveled nearly every square inch of Europe. I've been all over the Middle East, all over Asia, and obviously all over America, North America, and even beyond. My point is that my opinions and my beliefs are based off of solid research. Yes, a lot of it is esoteric knowledge that's orally passed down through Masonic rituals and other Masonic activities. But I really just wanted to get out there and say that, man, everybody out there needs to calm down. Okay? Everybody out there needs to calm the hell down, man. All of you political people, you need to shut the hell up, live and let live. All of you religious people out there, the whole reason America started, once again, by Freemasons, okay, was to avoid religious tyranny. Okay, things like putting the Bible in every school and shit like that, that is not America. Freedom of religion is a Masonic principle. It is not a Christian or Judeo principle, right? Freedom of speech, that is a Masonic principle. That is not a Christian Judeo principle. So you all need to understand this. People like this preacher would not have the freedom to sit here and preach his nonsense if not for those Masonic principles that literally formed our American Constitution. And again, I can bring receipts for all of this if people need me to. The point is that Freemasons are not evil. We never have been. Just because we go against the narrative, the gay pedophile Roman narrative, does not make us evil. I would encourage this guy to do some simple research. I would encourage him to learn some simple things. And before he goes out and starts talking crap about a group of people that he knows nothing about, go and join. Go and knock on a Masonic lodge's door and ask if you can just spend some time with them so that you can actually learn, other than watching YouTube videos and basing your opinion off this crap. Go do it! Anyway, it's been real and it's been fun. I'm hoping to get this posted pretty soon. So let me know what you think, and let's see if we can't get this this old Veterans Angle podcast up and going again. All right, y'all take care.